Okay, so we're recording, and we're going to talk about this morning. We'll go through this process of analyzing a survey. And so I'll just go through the steps and talk about it. And then after we do this, I'll let it record and I'll add closed captioning, and we'll put it onto in an announcement. But several people had surveys, and they wanted to know how to analyze a survey. And so one of my students in the other class had a survey, and we're just going to use hers. I asked her for permission, and so, but it's a very the survey does what it's supposed to do, and it's probably uniquely like at the beginnings of any survey. I know when I started doing survey research, um, I had to learn, and they always ask you to do a pilot study, and so you can look at the questions and see how the questions will group together and see how if you're asking the right question. And so um, uh, in this case, the survey was given to, it looks like 26 participants, and you can see some of the names of the variables across the top, but you'll notice that each participant answered all of the questions in the survey. And so the participants are listed on the left-hand side, just like we set up any database, and the variables are listed across the top, and their response on this Likert scale, this was in general a 4-point Likert scale, and the Likert scale was used for variance, to create a scale of variance in each variable. So a person would respond, except for gender, or they would probably respond between 1 and 4, and we'll see that. And so here we have their data, and it looks like if we go through here, there's it's basically a climate survey of how people are feeling at work and how they're doing at work and so on. So you get a good feel for how people are perceiving their work environment. And so when you get a survey like this, the first thing we're going to do with anything is we're going to go to Analyze, and we're going to just do the descriptive statistics. Now, if you want to know what each, if you were going to do this and you wanted to rebuild this survey and look at every question, then you might do a frequency. But we're just going to go ahead and do the descriptives today. And you can go all the way down and hold down the Shift key and highlight every one of them and move them all over so that you get them all over into the right-hand column. We're going to check these options, and we do want to know the variance and the range in each of the questions. And so we'll continue that, and we're not going to change the style. We're not going to do something called bootstrap. So we'll just say okay, and it will give us this output. Now, are you seeing the output or not? Guys, are you seeing? No, okay.
We don't see that.
All right, let me, that's what I realized the other day is you have to, there. So I have to change documents when I'm sharing the output. So now you should see the output.
Yes, we see it now.
Okay. Yep. So if you look at the output, and we'll do everything else now from this screen. So if you look at the output, it tells you that there's an N of 26. So we have 26 respondents, and that's good because at least now we know that everybody responded to each of these questions. It gives us the range. It gives us the minimum and maximum. It gives us the mean, standard deviation, and variance. And then you'll see this, how it goes. But this one question down here, only work vision, that was the one where people had more opinions about it. In other words, there was greater variability in this one on this Likert scale than there were on many of the others. So people tended to group in similar ways how they responded to these questions. So so we have our descriptives though, and the next thing we can do is go back to Analyze, and we'll do a correlation. So we go and do a bivariate correlation, and again we're going to just see if there's a correlation between any of these variables, and so we'll just put them all over there, including gender and their role. And so we will look at, we want to do a Pearson, we want to do a two-tailed correlation, we want to flag significant correlations, And I don't think there's anything we need to change up here. We don't need any more, we don't need the means. We already have all of that. So we can say continue and we're not changing any of those. So the next thing that you get then, minimize our pictures. So the next thing that you get is the correlation table that we're familiar with. Let's see. Let me make sure I let somebody in. Very good. Very good. We're glad to have you here. Who's that? Oh, John. Okay. So glad to have you here, John. So we will, if you look at the correlations, and it tells you that there's a correlation between gender and the level that they teach. That's probably what that is. There's a correlation, and so you'll see that the correlation, remember on correlation tables, there's basically two triangles and they say the same thing. And so, but you can see the correlation here, and the correlation is at the 0.01 level. And you can look around for some of the other correlations. Here's a correlation at the 0.05 level. A correlation between gender and negative talk. And so we can see all that, but you can go through the variables and you can see where there is a relationship between these different concepts in the survey. And so that will, and when you do your survey, you'll see the same kinds of things. You'll see if there is or is not a relationship between those variables and the aspects. Okay. So then what's the next kind of an analysis we can do? So we've done the descriptives and we've done the correlations. So the next thing you might want to do with a survey is then to look at, and it's called dimension reduction, or it's called a factor analysis. And what that's going to do is it's going to group the variables into, eventually it's going to group the variables into scales, but into variables that group together or are kind of asking the same question. So again, we're going to take all the variables, simply move them over into the variable area. We already have descriptives, so we really don't need anything new on this one. Now, since we've never done this before, let's make sure that we have, is that somebody coming in? No. Since we've never done this one before, you need to know that the method is called a principal component analysis. And so if you drop down, you would see that there's different kinds of analysis, but we're doing the very first one. It defaults to principal components, where you're going to do something called get an eigenvalue of greater than 1, based on eigenvalues greater than 1. It's okay. And we're going to just let the computer, it's like the computer takes the variables, puts them into a washing machine, and spins them around. And it spins them around until it finds the best fit for each of the variables. And so we're going to let it do it 25 times to see if it comes together. And we're going to do, and then there's this thing called rotation. We're going to do a rotation because when you do social studies research, when you do a survey research like this, you want that there's an extra statistical process. It's just called a rotation. We're going to do a Varimax rotation, and again, it's just another way to weight those variables and to make sure that we're finding the relationships that we're looking for. We're going to let that one also do it 25 times. Now you can change the number. You can let it do it to 100. I don't know that sometimes it stops prior to that. Sometimes it takes longer, and it'll tell you. But right now, we'll just leave it at the default of 25. If we were saving, if we were saving these variables and developing a scale, I would click save, and then it would just. The only difference is it would do a regression analysis, as well as it would give you an ANOVA table. We can click on that, and it'll just provide an additional little bit of statistics about the variables. We'll say continue, and options. In this case, we're not having any missing responses. Everybody responded to every question, which is good. So we're not, but we're exclude cases list-wise. If you had cases that did not have responses to every question, it would take them out. And which is, you don't want, you want to be able to compare responses that have, where somebody has responded to your entire survey and not just stopped in the middle or something. So we'll do that. We're going to sort the variables, the output by size, so that we can see it a little better. And we're going to also suppress some small coefficients. And we're just going to change this to 0.4. For our purposes, that's large enough. And so, and say continue. And so when we press this, we're going to say OK. And it'll give us lots of information. The first thing it gives you is the extraction for each one of the variables. So that's all of these different variables that were used in the study. So for every question, basically. It tells you about variance that the study is explaining. So if you look at this right here, it says cumulative variance. Also, same number over here, cumulative variance. It's the responses to the questions are explaining about 77 or 78% of the variance found in the study. So the variance would be how the respondents are responding to each of the questions. And so by this pattern that has developed, it's explaining about 78% of the variance. That's a high amount of variance that's being explained by this particular survey. We are not using this component matrix. We are using the rotated component matrix. And in doing so, you'll see how it created 7 component factors. And they could be, if we were developing a long-range survey, it could be 7 scales that we're measuring. And so one of the scales might be this tiredness scale that's over here. The very first one seems to be the strongest scale. And if you look at the names of the variables that are there, you'll see that the variables all relate to some level of tiredness. So worn out, emotionally drained. And look how the word energy is inversely proportional to the other variables. And so energy doesn't seem to fit. Tired and can be disconnected. So this little scale right here, let's remember these variables: worn out, emotionally drained, tired, and can be disconnected. Those might be the beginnings of a scale that we want to look at, because what we think is that these variables are all measuring the same concept. And how does it know that? Well, it's something called item response theory, but it's the patterns and the way that people respond to your survey. And what we want to know is is this a reliable scale? Is it every time someone takes this survey, is it going to produce reliable results? And so let's remember worn out, emotionally drained, tired, and can be disconnected. And we will look at those one more time. Yeah, we didn't ask it to do anything else. Okay. So reliability is the last piece of statistics that you would do with a survey. And you would go down to this thing called scale. We're going to look at the reliability analysis of those 4 variables. So those 4 variables were tired, emotionally drained, can be disconnected, and worn out. And we're not going to use energy because energy was inversely connected to those people. It was going the other direction. So we want to use the 4 variables on that particular component factor that had similar eigenvalues. They're all going in the same direction and all seem to be saying the same thing. We're also going to do something here called, you'll notice that there are several, but we're going to do something called a Cronbach's alpha. And a Cronbach's alpha measures the reliability of a scale. And so if we look at this, there's really nothing for us to change. We can look at the statistics. We have the descriptives. We can do that. We can, just so that we can see, we can look at the inner item correlation. We can look at the, let's see, let's do an F-test for this particular group of variables. We already have this information, but we can if we just want to know on these 4 variables, I think that's it. And so let's see what we get on these 4 variables and see if they're telling us the same information. And so it tells us that they processed all 26 respondents, that it shows us that the reliability statistics is a coefficient of 0.834, which is very high. And so we would have to say yes, in fact, that so anything between a 0.7, 0.8, 0.9 would tell us that the reliability factor component of Cronbach's alpha is very high and that the scale is actually measuring what we think it's measuring. So all of those questions are measuring something to do with being tired, emotionally drained, disconnected, and worn out. And so here's their inner item correlation. And you can see if there's, it's not going to give you any, it won't tell you if they're statistically significant, but it just gives you the relationship and how strong that relationship is between those particular variables. It's like any correlation table. It looks like the highest correlation coefficient is between emotionally drained and worn out. I would say yes, that sounds pretty true too. So now in realizing that the statistical formulas, the process of the computer, etc., doesn't speak English and has no idea what the words emotionally drained or worn out is. It is only looking at the pattern of responses of the people who took the survey. So if we look at, if you get a summary analysis, you can look here, but the ANOVA is more telling. It tells you that there's an F value of 3.391 and that between items, there's a significance at the 0.05 level. So in fact, the scale is reliable. You see the significance factor here at the 0.05 level, and then you see Cronbach's alpha here at the 0.834 level. So these are the different statistics that you can use in item analysis. And so I'll tell you what I'm going to do at this point. I'm going to turn this part off, and then I'll stop the recording, and then we can talk about all of this. Let me figure out how to do that. Stop recording.